All right, Jamie, go ahead.
All right. Can everybody hear me? Or Bill, can you give me a thumbs up? Can you hear me okay? All right.
Yes.
All right. And hopefully, well, you're probably hearing the doorbell as people are entering, and we'll just continue to welcome those chimes as we go through the next we have an hour and a half. I'm not planning on talking for a full hour and a half. But we'll leave some time at the end for questions. And Bill's also going to be monitoring the chat box. So if you do have a question, go ahead and put it in there. If it's something relevant to what we're talking about right at that moment, Bill's going to go ahead and feed that question to me. And otherwise, we'll wait till the end for those questions. But it's always hard doing webinars because you don't have the interaction with the audience. And so please don't hesitate to ask a question or to make a comment in the chat. So with that, as Bill said, my name is Jamie Knack. I'm an Extension Wildlife Outreach Specialist. I'm on the cold Madison campus today. I'm in the Department of Forest and Wildlife Ecology and also with the Division of Extension. And so what I was asked to cover for a topic is getting into some of the details of inventorying and monitoring wildlife on your property. And so the way I approach this topic is what can I share with you in terms of resources to learn about the wildlife that you have? So what is the potential? What do the species list look like for wildlife in Wisconsin? And then talk to you about some techniques that you could implement on your property to inventory and then subsequently to monitor wildlife species that you're interested in. And then along with that, there are a number of statewide monitoring programs already going on, some by the Department of Natural Resources, some by nonprofits, and other groups. And I'm going to share some of those with you as well, because one thing that you could do is either adopt their protocols and or contribute your information into that data set. So we'll get into that in a little bit. All right. So if we just think a little bit about what the resource base is for wildlife in Wisconsin, the species I'm going to be talking about are all vertebrate taxa, so birds, mammals, reptiles, and amphibians. And I put the number of each taxa, how many species we have. And so for birds, we see a pretty big range between 300 and 400. And of course, I should know how many birds we have in the state. But there's this large range because it depends on when we're counting or when we're looking. And so this represents both residents and migratory birds. And so I believe the most recent data from the Wisconsin Society of Ornithology's website, over 441 species have been confirmed in the state. About 220 plus or minus a few nest in the state, so considered residents. And then that again, exact number really depends on what survey or what atlas we're referring to for those numbers. So birds, around 300 to 400 species. For mammals, quite a few less, so 72. Again, plus or minus a few, depends on if we're counting mountain lions. We can all agree that there's been sightings of mountain lions, but what we don't have is a breeding population of mountain lions. Every detection we've been able to confirm at this point with DNA evidence has been a male and a juvenile lion from the Black Hills of South Dakota. And so we've yet to document a breeding population. So technically, we wouldn't maybe put mountain lions on our Wisconsin's wildlife list. However, you as a landowner may end up detecting one. So that 72 plus or minus a few just depends on how we're counting. So for reptiles, three groups of animals in Wisconsin. We have turtles, we have snakes, and we have four species of lizards in the state. And then amphibians, we have frogs, we have one species of toad, and then we have salamanders. So a term that I may slip into using is herptiles, and that's a collective term we use to talk about reptiles and amphibians. And a lot of that has to do with their habitat needs, their management, are very similar that we talk about herptile management. And so we're going to talk about surveys for birds, mammals, and herptiles today. All right, so a couple definitions. We're talking about inventorying, and that is essentially collecting baseline information, a starting point. What data do we have as we first get started? So we want to determine what are the wildlife species using our property right now. And then monitoring is basically repeating that inventory. So monitoring is keeping track of wildlife species, their presence, and or their abundance through time. So now you might ask, why do I need to inventory or monitor? Or maybe needs not the right word, but why would I want to inventory and monitor? So again, it gives us some baseline information of what species are using our property. It can be a measure of species richness, and what that is the number of birds, so the number of different species of birds using our property, or the number of those 72 mammals, how many different species? Do we have 30? Do we have 25? How many different species do we have? So it's a measure of richness. And by having this information, it can help us define, first of all, define our goals, but then also evaluate our land management goals. And so I always tell people, you might start inventorying wildlife on your property, looking for wildlife that you haven't necessarily come across, and discover, for example, that you have flying squirrels. And now, as a result of that discovery, you are changing or adapting your management goals because you're very interested in keeping them and increasing their population and continuing to assist that species. The monitoring side of this, so monitoring wildlife on an annual basis really helps us monitor population trends and also can help us determine the health of our habitat. And then it should be fun, right? We want to get outside. I'm guessing most of you enjoy working outside. It's another excuse to be out there walking your properties and enjoying the fruits of your labor. So it's also very exciting to share what you found with others, whether that's sharing pictures with your family or sharing information with your neighbors. But also you have an opportunity to contribute your findings to both state and national programs that monitor wildlife to help inform our understanding of wildlife populations and wildlife health. And then I'm going to put a plug in for another strong reason I feel to get involved with inventory and monitoring wildlife, and that is to build a connection to your property for the next generation, but also as a great way to engage kids outside, connect them to your property, but just get them involved in nature. So it's probably no surprise to you, but our kids are finding a lot of their amusement, their entertainment behind a screen. In fact, the American children right now are spending as few as 30 minutes in unstructured play. So not sports practices, but just unstructured free play outside. And they're spending more than 7 hours each day in front of a screen, whether that's a TV, a smartphone, a computer at school. Not enough time outside to explore nature and what most of us on this webinar experienced and why we fell in love with the outdoors and the property that we own. So you can think about these techniques and how you might incorporate children or grandchildren into the mix as you move forward. So in order for you to be able to inventory wildlife, you're first going to have to learn how to ID a number of species, but also decide on what groups of animals or if there's a very specific species that you want to focus on. And then you're going to want to acquire and review resources for identifying those potential species. And again, I do want to preface all of this by saying this is not work that you have to do. This is work that you can do, but it should be fun. So this shouldn't be seen as a chore or something that you have to do on your property. This should be something that you want to do and you're engaged in, and you can start small and expand from there. So I think at least in my experience, just learning how to ID wildlife is half the fun and going out there and seeing what you can detect on your own property. So one thing you can start with is visiting the DNR's website. Use the keyword search ecological landscapes. The DNR has divided the state into 16 or defined 16 different ecological landscapes. Each of these landscapes has different attributes and as such different management options or opportunities. And so you can actually click on each one of these regions and you will get a drop-down menu then of information about that area or that ecological landscape. So you'll learn about the physical and biotic environment, the rare species and the natural communities, the soils, the hydrology, the climate, the bedrock, the land cover, all of those different things. And that can really be important because it suggests what opportunities are available to you and perhaps what wildlife species you have opportunities to manage for or to have on your property. And then within each of those ecological communities, you likely have one or more habitat types. And so you may be in the northern forest, but within that northern forest community, you may have a forest habitat, but you may also have some shrub communities or some of these other more specific habitat types. And so that is also something to kind of keep in mind what's available on your property. All right, then I'm going to spend some time just going through wildlife resources that I'm familiar with that I use on a fairly regular basis. Um, this is, items that you can kind of collect as a resource library, and some of these you probably already have. But in terms of identifying birds, certainly field guides, if you still prefer a physical field guide. There are really two different types of field guides. Some are illustrated versions, like this Peterson guide or the Sibley's Bird Guide. Those have illustrations in them. And then the other option is photographic field guides. And the Audubon guides are photographs, and so are the Stokes. Really a matter of preference, personal preference. Other things to look at when choosing a field guide is organization, the level of detail, and things like that. In addition, when I'm working with folks to identify a bird, either through email or over the phone, I often will refer them to the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, and they have a section called All About Birds. And it's essentially an online bird guide. So I can, for example, send them a link to the call of the barred owl to help them distinguish if that's what they're hearing in their backyard, or send them two different pictures of a purple finch and a house finch, or and a house finch, and see if they can help, see if that helps them to identify that species. So that is basically an online field guide. In addition, there are some resources that become even more specific. So Peterson has a field guide to bird nests. And in some cases, the structure of the nest, the location, the color, size of the eggs can help you identify what bird species made that nest. And in addition, Mark Elbrock has a book called Bird Tracks and Signs. So it looks at feathers and tracks in the ground and other sign besides seeing the bird itself to help you distinguish what species that is. And then we have the whole world of nature apps for download for use on our phone. And I've just put in two of them here, two examples. One that I like to use is iBird Pro. That's the one on the left. And it looks like it's free from what I grabbed here, but sometimes there's a small fee for these apps, maybe $15, $20, something like that. So that is on your phone and becomes a searchable through using filters. And so you can filter by hitting this search. So let's say you see a bird and now you're trying to figure out what it is. You can hit that search and basically you're toggling on or off different features. So what habitat type is it in? what size is it, what shape or silhouette is it, what is the shape or the length of the bill, what are the primary colors, things like that to further get it down. So in this case, I knew I was looking at an Oriole, but what kind of Oriole? And in this case, I was probably looking between Baltimore and Orchard Orioles that we hear or that we have. How can I figure that out? So I knew the family, I typed that in and I got it down to 10 out of 940 species. So then you can further work on that list, but you could do it simply from size. I do see the question in the chat, which does Cornell have a library of bird songs? And yes, so that All About Birds website I mentioned on the previous slide, if we were to type in Baltimore Oriole, it would come up with the range map, breeding status, all of that information. And then also it would give you representative sounds, both songs and calls. And we're going to talk about Merlin in the next slide here. And then similar to iBird Pro, just a matter of personal preference, Audubon Bird Guide also is an app that you can download and install. And same things, you can use that to filter. I will just make the comment now. There's going to be a number of things that I talk about that do involve technology. And when we talk about kids and I, complain that, we're not getting kids outside as much as we used to and they're behind screens all the time, this is where I think we have to meet them halfway. If we can use technology as a means to get them into the field, or at least allow them to use technology while they're in the field for these reasons, things like these apps, and some of the iNaturalist and citizen science programs that we'll talk about later could be the hook. And certainly I would welcome them using in the field. So keep those things in mind. And then, yes, I see there's been some comments already about Merlin, and I'm glad to hear that people are discovering Merlin. But again, another product out of Cornell Lab of Ornithology is the app called Merlin Bird ID. And this has really revolutionized, I think, the challenge of learning bird songs, and made it easier for the novice to get started. I'll say it is not 100% perfect. Merlin is better in certain situations. And then also, so when you download the app, and it is a free app, you can do a couple of things. There is a bird ID wizard, so you can answer just 3 simple questions about a bird you're trying to identify, and Merlin will spit out a list of possible matches. In addition, you can record. So right here on the right-hand side, the sound ID is up on the Merlin page. And essentially, this would be an active recording. So they're recording a song right now. And you'll actually see the sound waves and it try to populate what bird is singing at that moment. And then you can actually record that as well. And again, it's generally pretty accurate, but not 100%. So you have to make sure it makes sense for your area. And then lastly, you can also upload a photo of a bird and it will help you identify that species. And then another way, so having Merlin and walking around in the woods and hearing a bird sing, being able to record it and know that, okay, that's an American robin. I see it, I hear it singing, and Merlin is confirming that, can really help your brain kind of process and remember that song and that visual. Before we had Merlin, what we would often do is listen to CDs. And so these would be bird song CDs where it would play the song and then tell you what the bird is, and then often describe it by a common mnemonic that you would use to remember that bird song. So some common mnemonics would be "Who cooks for you?" And I think a number of you on the call probably know what bird has the song "Who cooks for you? Who cooks for you all?" But that would be the barred owl, or the "Poor Sam Peabody, Peabody, Peabody," which would be the white-throated sparrow. And so we would learn songs by learning the mnemonic and remembering it that way. And so those CDs are also available. There's probably podcasts or things you can download and listen to while you're driving as well. All right, so I'm going to switch gears from birds into some of the mammal resources. And it's a little bit more limited, I would say, but really just getting yourself a good field guide. And so the mammals of North America, the Peterson Field Guide is great. There's also one that's for the Great Lakes region, which would narrow it down a bit more regionally if you're interested in Wisconsin. National Geographic also has a smaller pocket guide. And then if you're really interested in this, I would say within the department here, everybody's probably got copies of the Mammal Tracks and Sign book in their office library. But this will be tracks, scat, homes, chewings, all sorts of mammal sign. That is all in this edition by Mark Elbrock. It's a complement to the bird tracks and sign that I mentioned earlier. So really good book if you want to get into identifying tracks and other sign from mammals. Okay, and then with the herptiles, so again, adding amphibians and reptiles together, about 35 species, and we would have much more, oh, well, let's say actually there is much more abundant diversity in the southern part of the U.S. And again, that comes down to these animals are cold-blooded, and so they maintain their temperature by their environment, and they're not able to maintain their own body temperature. And so they survive Wisconsin and days like today by through hibernation. So they're not migrating at least long distances, and they're not able to stay active on the landscape. They're not adapted for that. So these are species that hibernate and are really only active on our landscape from about April until October. And so when we're thinking about identifying herps, the 35 species, rather than go to a large field guide that includes southern parts of the US and a lot more diversity, I would point you to the Department of Natural Resources website where you can look at species accounts for these various groups. And when you click on salamanders, you'll have a drop-down list of the 7 salamanders in the state, each with their own little field guide description. And in this case, we're talking about the wood turtle, which is a threatened species, and you can see all the shaded counties where the wood turtle is present or distributed in the state. In addition, I think this is well worth acquiring, but if you go to the website at the bottom of the screen here, there'll be a PDF that you can fill out and send in $10 to the Department of Natural Resources, and they will mail you these 3 publications. So Amphibians of Wisconsin, Turtles and Lizards, and then Snakes of Wisconsin. And this is really representative of the 35 species we have. And so I think that's a very nice resource to pursue. And then in addition, by using the keyword search here, amphibians and reptiles by county, you could look through those 35 species, paying specific attention to the county where your land is located in, and making a check mark next to the list on species that are present in your county. And so this, again, is the eastern tiger salamander. If you're in the Northeast, it's not to say that it's not there, but there hasn't been a recorded sighting. So they tend to be more in the Southeast and the Northwest part of the state. All right. In addition, similar to birds, every frog and toad species has its own unique call. So the American toad sounds very different than the green frog or the mink frog and so on. And so this is a lot more manageable than the 300 to 400 bird species that we have in the state. But if you were to learn the 11 frog and 1 toad call, you would be able to listen for and document what species you have of frogs on your property, which is, a form of inventory that we'll talk about. So this is just an example of a website, the Wisconsin Frog and Toad Survey, where they do have all of the recordings in one place specific to our state. So you're not looking at a national website and picking through a list of many more frogs than we have. In addition, if you enjoy being on YouTube and want to go that route, you can also do a search for Frogs and Toads of Wisconsin on YouTube, and they'll also have some descriptions on identification and list the calls or have voice recordings of the calls there as well. Okay, one other slide here, just to talk about some other general apps that might be of interest to you. So there is one called Seek by iNaturalist, and it uses the power of image recognition technology to identify plants and animals all around you. So essentially, you take your phone, you open up the app, you go to the camera, and you take a picture of, it could be a mushroom, it could be fungi, amphibian, could be a plant, and you'll take a picture and then it will try to narrow it down. So in this case, it did identify that this was a monarch. Sometimes it'll get you into the family of a plant, but this is another app that you might enjoy in the field. In addition, Leaf Snap is it works the same way. It's an app that you use to take pictures of plants, and it will help you identify those plants. And then lastly, I wanted to mention Wisconsin eBird. It's an online database of bird observations provided by scientists and amateur naturalists. And what's nice about eBird is that you can also use it to look for bird sightings in your area of rare birds, or just even get lists that other birders, avid birders, have contributed to see what's available or what species are being documented in your general area. And so that might be a place to explore. And I'll talk about eBird again in a little bit. So I'll take a pause there just to offer folks, if you have a nature app or a field guide or any other bird, mammal, reptile, and amphibian resource that you like to use, feel free to share with us in that chat.
Jamie, I got a couple of questions for you.
Perfect.
Someone asked about the Cornell Lab site and wondered if there was bird songs on that. Do you know if they happen to have
Yep.
it on there?
So Cornell Lab of Ornithology, they are the ones that have Merlin, but also when I mentioned that All About Birds page, that's on Cornell. So All About Birds is Cornell Lab of Ornithology's online website. So when you go to that page, you can type in any bird you want. It'll give you a whole field guide worth of information, different different images, and yes, it will have audio files of their songs, their calls, all of that.
So I've used the Merlin app a bit to help to identify birds that are calling in an area,
Yeah.
and I've often wondered about how accurate it is. And you may have talked about this, but I wondered if you could comment on that and how you verify the accuracy of what you're hearing or what the app is identifying.
Yeah, so I think for me, a lot of times because I've had ornithology and I'm familiar with a number of birds, for me, it's just confirmation that I remember what I was taught a lot of times. But I think you do have to, you can always check it if it's something that you have never seen before, um, or sound that is just not recognizable, and the image that pops up that the Merlin says it is, you can always question that, right? So you can go back then to Cornell Lab of Ornithology, for example, or your field guide, and look that bird up, and then look at the region, the range for that bird, and does that make sense? What I have found, so this last spring, I was out in the field in the spring, and I heard a whippoorwill, and it's unmistakable, but I wanted to see what Merlin, Merlin would then, it records it, and I just wanted to have it recorded because it's not a sound we hear all that time and all that often anymore. And so Merlin couldn't identify it. I'm like, well, that's not what's going on here. Well, then I realized that within Merlin, there are a number of audio packs or downloads by region. And so I did not have an additional song pack downloaded where whippoorwill would have been in it. So when you download Merlin, I think you can go into the app itself and look at what you all have downloaded, and then you can add additional regions. Like if in the northeastern part of the country or southwest and so on. So once I did that and downloaded, I don't remember if it was by eastern region or if it was Great Lakes, how that was. But when I downloaded that, then it picked up the whippoorwill. So that would be something to look at as well. Um, and yeah, it's just you do have to kind of, I think it's pretty good for a lot of the common stuff. From what I've heard, it can be inaccurate. It's kind of hard to think about it this way, but birds have, just like we have different accents, they have a little bit different dialects in their songs. And so when those recordings were made for, let's just say, blue jays, um, they were gathered around the country, but maybe not, didn't encompass all of the different variation in the blue jay song or call. And so that's where there can be some inaccuracies.
There's a couple of suggestions for other apps, Leaf Snap and Picture This for plant identification. Someone had problems in the Play Store finding iBird Pro. Maybe it's not available there yet. Maybe not the Pro
Um,
version. Is that what you're thinking?
well, iBird Pro, I just looked it up to be able to grab the picture for this presentation and it was available. I can look here too. Um, yeah, Leaf Snap is on the screen right now. And that is one that I know works well. Yeah, I'm not seeing it right now. I personally have iBird Pro downloaded on my phone here and have been using it. So I'd have to dig into that a little bit more, but I think it's still available.
What about reclassifications of birds? Is that there's a question about keeping up with that. I recommend how to keep up with that.
That's a really good question. It is, I believe it's oh gosh. Well, for Wisconsin, just going to the Wisconsin Society for Ornithology, they would keep up the most recent taxonomic names for birds. And I'm trying to think what it is national then. Um, I'd have to confirm that too. Somebody on
Oh,
here might know what the national one is. Um, but for Wisconsin, I would refer to the Wisconsin Society for Ornithology for the current classifications and naming.
there's a suggestion for amphibians and reptiles of Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan by Sheldon, a field guide to all 77 species and subspecies for the Wisconsin Great Lakes. Sounds like a great publication. Are you familiar with that one?
Yep, I am on the shelf here, and that would be another really good one. Yeah, the big thing with reptiles and amphibians is that one is one you can really kind of try to narrow down to the Great Lakes, or as I said, that three set publication by the DNR. Just really whittle it down because when you look across the country in North America, there's a lot more diversity than what we have here. So it helps narrow it down. But if you travel, certainly looking at some of the reptile and amphibian publications by Peterson or on a wider geographic scale would be worth it.
All right, that's it for the questions. You want to continue? Go ahead.
All right, sounds good. Okay, so those are all resources for you to think about in terms of being able to identify what you have. Doesn't mean you need to have all of them, and maybe you already have a couple species in mind that you're really interested in inventorying, looking for, etc. So you're going to have some resource library. In addition to that, before you start the inventorying, you're also going to want to create a map of your property. And that's going to help with recording sightings and observations. And again, I should say, you don't have to do this, but it's really nice to have a map. And it could be very simple. It could be hand drawn. Um, it could be a plat map that you trace over a clear paper. Again, it could be something you create yourself to scale on a clean piece of paper. Um, if you would like to do something from an aerial photography standpoint, just going into Google Maps, or if you have OnX or other software. This one I started just by using Google Maps. And there's a really nice tutorial out there. I found it on YouTube. I just Googled how to create a property map with Google Maps. And it was a very nice tutorial that showed you how to grab the map like this and be able to use um, features to draw your property boundary, and then to add in features like gates or whatever it is that you might want to distinguish. These were little clear cuts that I made polygons around. So lots of potential there. And I mean, we could do a whole presentation on mapping, um, different mapping tools that you can use. So the idea is that you want to be able to put some landmarks on there, be able to describe some of the habitat types. So looking at this one here, they looked at some egg fields, some sharecropped corn. They describe this as all being mixed hardwoods, 25 acres. It'd be great if you could, estimate the age of that hardwood stand if you know when there's been a cutting or a harvest in the past. If you know some of the tree species, that's eventually what you're trying to determine is what are the different habitat types available on your property. Over here, they had 20-year aspen. Up in here, 45-year-old aspen. It just starts to give us a feel for what that property looks like. We know we can put this property in its ecological landscape, but now we can then add the different habitats available and then think about what species we would expect to be here. And when you start doing your inventory, you can start to keep track of, okay, where do I see the woodcock on my property? Or why am I not seeing this? Or do I have flying squirrels? All of those questions you can start to determine what habitats they're using. Okay, so resources, a property map, and then some other items to think about. A field notebook or a journal. In some cases, the techniques I'm going to talk to you about have their own data sheet, some of which we have examples available for you. So you might need a specific data sheet, pencils, camera, uh, which or could be a standalone camera or your phone with a camera, GPS unit or compass, binoculars. Always don't leave home without your binoculars, and plastic bags if you wanted to collect things to then bring back for additional identification, whether that's some plants, maybe some scat that you're trying to identify, things like that. And again, I think in this picture, I tried to grasp or tried to have you visualize, using technology in the field. Again, if these are all ways that we can get youngsters outdoors, that's great. I can't tell you how many times I have young kids in programs that have never used a pair of binoculars before. So let's make sure they all get a chance to see the world through a pair of binoculars. And then just another note here too, the field notebook or nature journal, if you're looking for ways to engage your children or grandchildren with your property. Again, this comes down to, our busy lives, but just giving, buying your grandchildren their own journal with some cool gel pens or colored pencils, whatever it might be, maybe making a place for them in the woods or hanging up a hammock for them and just giving them the opportunity to reflect and have that quiet time and sketch. So I am definitely not an artist. Nobody in my family is an artist, but there are certainly people who are extremely talented and if given a journal or a notebook, would really put it to great use. So keep that in mind. Otherwise, just, a notebook where you're taking observations. And then I will just mention the idea of phenology. And so phenology is it's a little bit different than inventory and monitoring, but it may be something that you want to do in conjunction with your inventory and monitoring. And that is basically tracking nature through the seasons on your property. So whether you start January 1 or, whatever the start date is, but it essentially involves observing and recording reoccurring events, such as when do leaves appear for the different tree species, when do flowers bloom, when do birds migrate. So, when do you see your first chipmunk come out of hibernation? And those are things you can record on your property throughout the year. And over time, although Leopold and his family recorded phenological events, and over time that data was collected, and there's a phenology calendar that the Aldo Leopold Foundation offers every year. And within that calendar, you can look at what the average dates are based on his and his family's phenological cording. So I think this one, Harry would, what is that? Hoary, gosh, I can't even read it. Like St. John's wort begins to bloom, different natural phenomenon and their average start time. So again, you could do that on your own property. All right. And then so with that information and those materials or equipment, you're ready to think about some inventorying and monitoring techniques to deploy on your property. And so I want to point you towards a publication from the Wildlife in Your Land series. So this is a series that was done by the Department of Natural Resources. A lot of the names here, actually all the names here, were former extension wildlife specialists as well. And there's actually 14 publications in this series. So if you go to the website and just type in wildlife in your land, you can look at all of these publications. But this one in particular looks at different inventory and monitoring protocols that the agency has used, the Department of Natural Resources, that they felt could be used for private landowners, and others that are not necessarily ongoing monitoring by the agency, but ways that you can get a feel for what's on your property. And so I encourage you to go through and look at this publication that's available on the DNR website. Okay, and then just a couple of notes here. So timing is really important when we're thinking about inventorying and monitoring. So keep in mind that some birds migrate. So if you're doing your bird, looking for birds in the summer, you're not necessarily getting, well, you're definitely not getting a holistic look at the number of birds or the different species of birds that utilize your property. And then some animals are only evident from April to October. So certainly those herptiles that I mentioned, but also we have some mammals that hibernate during that time. So not that you can't inventory for some of the other mammals or birds from April to October, but just keep in mind that that's not going to be the time period that you'd be looking for herptiles. And then we have animals that are active during the day and others that are active at night. So we need to keep that in mind if we want a complete species richness look at our property. And then we have animals that are residents, can be found year round, and then others that are only here during certain times of the year. And that can be not just the migratory species that we mentioned, but even things like snowy owls that come down for short periods of time, but they're not residents year round. All right, I'm going to pause there and see if there are any other questions right now.
None in the chat. I had
Okay.
one about
Yeah.
taking notes in your journal. Is there some beyond like time of day and the date note details you want to capture in a journal that might be really good things to capture to help you in your management or in the long-term goals, things like that?
Yeah, and I think we'll get into this a little bit when we talk about the different survey techniques and what the goals are. So for example, when we're looking at collecting information on frog calls, air temperature and water temperature can be really important because that influences their timing. So if we're looking for frogs and the water is too cold, it's information that we're collecting that it's not that those species are not there, but maybe we didn't catch them during the right time. So again, you can compare that information. So I would say, at a minimum, your date, your location, probably some weather, some notes regarding the weather, and other, just general observations. But then it'll just really depend on the detail of the survey that you're trying to do.
There's a question about if we ever get birds from other parts of the world that don't normally show up here, not normally
Oh,
present. How often
absolutely.
is that very common?
Well, it'd be they're rare occurrences, but if you paid attention to the, some of the rarities we've had. Flamingos this past year in Wisconsin. I mean, obviously that's not super common. The Wisconsin eBird website is again a place where you can kind of look through that information and see some of these rare bird sightings and some of the oddities that we've had across the state. I was on a listserv that just had a kind of a summary of 2024 and some of the rarities that we've had. So yeah.
And you started out talking about mountain lions. How
Hmm.
rare are they in Wisconsin? Is it like once in every 10 years we get someone finds one, or is it even more common than that?
Yeah, more common than that now. So since the explosion of using trail cameras on properties, um, we've had a lot more detections. I shouldn't say a lot more, but we've definitely had detections, and I think that has helped to capture them, but we don't have like a good idea of numbers of mountain lions because they do have really large home ranges and they're typically wandering males that work their way through the state and either continue east or even head back west. Um, and so what we've been able to get is DNA evidence through scat or hair or blood. And that's where we've been able to track those animals back as juvenile males dispersing from that Black Hills population. Again, no residents here in that they haven't, we have not documented a female, and so those males continue to wander. If you were to go to the Department of Natural Resources website and just type in cougar sightings, they were maintaining a list of, I don't know how much they update it, but just pictures of different sightings. And you could see sometimes locations where those sightings were. And in some ways, like by looking at the date, you could suspect or infer that it might be the same individual, but really no way of knowing for sure.
Okay, no
But I
further questions. Go ahead.
Okay. All right. We'll jump into birds. All right. So my intention here is to take a look at that publication that I shared earlier, the Inventory and Monitoring Wildlife on Your Land, and to pick 3 to 5 different surveys that you could do on your property and just talk you through them. Keep in mind that there's others in that publication, and it really depends, to some degree. Are you interested in a full are you trying to figure out all the bird species, or are there certain bird species that you're particularly interested in? All right, so the most simple is to just keep a checklist of the birds that you've documented on your property. And you're recording all of the birds. It's giving you presence or absence information. So this indigo bunting, I saw it on my property. It's a species I've had. Um, Pileated woodpecker, maybe you have yet to document that species on your property, right? So this list of birds can be done on a weekly basis, monthly, annually. It could be over the lifetime that you've started doing this, so over multiple years. It's a list that you would keep year round. And then I encourage people, Bill, you were talking about what information to record, but if you do start recording locations on these checklists on that property map, so for example, we see the indigo bunting. Where did I see it? You maybe indicate that on a map because it's maybe a infrequent bird for you and you're interested in remembering where it was. That can help you start to make connections about habitat preferences and habitat use. And the sighting of, for example, the indigo bunting or the lack of sighting a pileated woodpecker may inform your management or guide your next steps. So a step more, to be more complicated or to get more in depth, you could do breeding bird surveys on your property. And this involves long-term study that monitors the status of bird populations. And so there's a associated program called the North American Breeding Bird Survey that's used to monitor breeding bird populations across North America. And certainly we do this in Wisconsin. But you could do a similar survey on your own property. And it essentially would involve developing a route. creating a route that you're going to walk or use a UTV or drive, depending on how large your property is. And you're going to stop at different points, so point counts, um, and listen to the birds that well, record the birds that you see, the species that you see, and the species that you hear. And so ideally, you're doing this in June during the breeding season when they are singing a lot more and they're on territory. So by doing this, you end up getting an estimate of relative abundance. So not just I have a pileated woodpecker on my property, but now I've heard, two of them, or getting an idea of how many you have from year to year. And then there are guidelines for how far apart each of your point counts is so that you're not double counting these species. And so this would help you get an idea of what are the bird species that are actually using your property for breeding purposes. All right, and here's just a look at that eBird that I mentioned earlier. So eBird, I believe, is around the world. I think, yeah, I think it's more than just North America. But you can drill down into eBird of Wisconsin. And so, for example, we could type in snowy owl. I do this a fair amount just to see if there's been recent sightings of snowy owls in the area, or if they've um, where they're being seen. But you can type in that name and you can kind of zoom in and get a heat map of locations of snowy owls. And you can do it through the calendar year, you can do it for a specific month, but you can also explore other data that people have reported. So their species maps, their birding lists, basically. So it's just, there's a lot of information. So this is an example of citizen science that is then mined for research purposes, but also, anybody can explore. All right, another survey technique for birds is if you're interested in doing nest box surveys for some of the cavity nesters that you may have on your property. You can provide artificial structures for them and then monitor the productivity. So you can test the effectiveness of different types of houses or style of houses. You can test which habitat, what their habitat preferences are, what areas are more productive, and just in general monitor productivity and population health. I will say, obviously not all of our bird species use cavities, so it's a small subset of them that do, and they use natural cavities. So maintaining your snags or hanging on to dead trees, leaving them stand when it's safe to do so is certainly a management activity that you can do to help those cavity nesters. But you can also supplement with these artificial nest boxes. What's important to know is that each species has its own preference for style and habitat location of these boxes. And there's been a lot of research done. So for example, with the bluebird, we have the Bluebird Restoration Association of Wisconsin. They have done a tremendous amount of research um, on nest box styles and placement, distance between boxes because they can be territorial, or they are territorial. And so you should use that information to inform the style that you choose. Or for example, the wood duck box up here, there's a specific dimension for the size of the opening. If it's larger than that, you're going to have other species like squirrels or raccoons that can more easily get into and depredate that nest box, and too small and the wood ducks can't get in. So again, and then placements and how to avoid predators, things like that. So a nest box survey, usually done in March through August, keeping track of the number of eggs, whether they were successfully hatched, recording what species, and things like that. So a few things with the nest box surveys for resources here. Again, the Cornell Lab of Ornithology has a program called Nest Watch. When you go to that website, they have facts on, like, it's called right bird, right house, but you could Google for a wood duck box and it'll give you plans for wood duck boxes, but then also indicate like what direction should the opening be facing, how high off the ground, what type of, should it be a pole mount or mounted on a tree, what type of material should the wood be, um, things like that. So lots of great information right off that website by searching the name. This is kind of what a data sheet might look like for doing a nest box survey that you would repeat year after year. Um, the Bluebird Restoration Association of Wisconsin would be a phenomenal website to visit if you're interested in starting your own Bluebird trail, nest box trail. And you can kind of register your trail and submit that information, the data that you're collecting, to help inform um, the greater community about the status of bluebirds in Wisconsin. If you're interested in doing some woodworking, this is a nice publication here, but there are certainly others. This one is from the Minnesota DNR called Woodworking for Wildlife. All right, another group of bird species that you could inventory and then subsequently monitor from year to year is to do feeder bird surveys. So again, of the 300 to 400 birds that we have that visit Wisconsin, there's only a subset of them, maybe 20, 30 birds that utilize feeders, but you can document their presence and absence, and you can track increases and declines of winter bird populations over time. So this is done typically from November to April when we're feeding birds. The information can help us track the expansion or the contraction of winter ranges of species over time, but you could use it as a home science experiment for young kids. And you could look at documenting food preferences, put out a couple different feeders, put out two of the same feeders with different food in them, and look at, what are their food preferences, what are their bird feeder preferences. And it can also be a way to monitor for disease. And that leads into a little bit that if you are going to feed birds, which birds do not need us to feed them over the winter for the most part, it more satisfies our human interest in being able to observe them. But with bird feeding comes some responsibility then to keep those feeders clean, to maintain the feeders, especially through late winter, early spring. And then feeders can also have some issues with attracting other wildlife that you may not want to attract. So anywhere from bears that are waking up in the spring, it's time to take those bird feeders down because they'll see them as a um, good source of food when a lot of the natural foods aren't available on the landscape yet. So, and yeah, so lots of different questions you could ask, and then subsequently monitor as it pertains to backyard bird feeding. All right, another group of birds that you could inventory and monitor would be some of the game birds that may call your property home. So ruffed grouse, ringneck pheasant, wild turkey, gray partridge, also known as Hungarian partridge, which we really don't have too many of anymore, but they may be in your area. Objective here is basically to provide information on the reproductive success of game birds for that specific breeding year, and then over time give you an index to the trends of those game bird populations. The game bird surveys are typically done in August, for the month of August. And if you're doing this on your own, just more casually, you would want to record the number of, for example, ruffed grouse broods that you come across on your property, how many young are in each brood that you see. You were going to do that only during daylight hours in August. You don't want to include, if you know it's the same brood that you're seeing day in and day out, you don't want to continue to record it, but you're essentially trying to figure out how many broods do you have on your property and what is the average poult or number of chicks per brood. And then over time, you can look at an index to the trend. So are those ruffed grouse population or broods increasing, decreasing? Same for turkeys. And if you did want to participate, you can participate in the Department of Natural Resource does this annually. And that's the Game Bird bird survey. You can grab this QR code and it'll take you to an app that you can download and you can submit that information. But again, you can take this information just on a casual basis for your own property. Keep it personally, or you could take it a step further and submit that information to the DNR. And then the last one I'll share with the birds gets much more specific. So for those of you that may be interested in really determining what's going on with your ruffed grouse population, there are a couple of different surveys that you could do. One is a spring drumming survey, which is essentially taking your property map and walking around in the spring between mid-April and late May and listening for the drumming sound of the male grouse. And then you can map that location. And they're, again, territorial, so you won't have them too close by, too close by. But usually they'll be within 100 meters of each other is kind of there'll be at least 100 meters between drumming males. But if you can plot those on your property, that'll give you an idea of how many drumming males you have in a given year. And you can compare that then from year to year. I'd also encourage you to map those locations so that you can take note of the successional stage of the woodlands that they're using. And over time, as grouse use different age classes for drumming, you'll see how your habitat changes impact where the drumming is occurring. And then subsequently in the fall, if you are a hunter and you're actively hunting the grouse, or even as a bird watcher, user of your property, as you come across ruffed grouse, you would be counting the number of flushes per hour that you're either hunting or specifically walking to flush grouse. And so you want to be somewhat, intentional. You want to, if you're going to go do a flush count, you would do the actual intentional walking for ruffed grouse, not just recording every time you happen to flush a grouse on your property in the fall, but you would do it with intentionality to be walking through cover and keeping track of how many grouse you flush by the hour. And I'm going to go ahead and pause there and see if there's any questions regarding birds.
I got a couple questions for
Okay.
you. Putting up different styles of birdhouses is a really interesting idea. How many different varieties you think you could put up to try to, are we talking dozens, or is there like a handful of different styles of birdhouses to kind of capture the breadth of birds you might see in your property?
Yeah, so I was thinking about it more in terms of, let's say, for Eastern bluebirds, there is a style of birdhouse called the North American, it's called NABS, North American, uh, must be breeding survey, but it's their style of bluebird house. There's also one called a Peterson bluebird house. And so you could test on your own property. Those are both house designs recommended for bluebirds, but which one is more effective on your property? And so you could look at that. And some of the things that play in with bluebirds are black flies, um, tree swallows, other competitors for those boxes, whether it be wrens or tree swallows. Um, so just location and style may vary just on your own property. But the other thing you can do is look at some of those nest box designs. So figure out what cavity nesters you have on your property by either doing breeding bird survey or just in general keeping track of the birds on your property. And then you could look for the specific house designs for those birds. So it's reasonable on, 10 or more acres to think that you could have a chickadee nest box, depending on the habitat. If you had open prairie or grassland, that you could have bluebird nest boxes, right? And so it would depend then at assessing what species you have, what their habitat needs are, and then which ones you can build a nest box for. So wood ducks, I mean, if you have wetlands nearby, even a quarter mile away, you can potentially put up a wood duck nesting box.
And then the other question I had was about when you talked about groups of birds, like you had pictures of turkey, a group of turkey. I can't remember what a group of turkey are called. What is it?
A brood. Yep.
A brood. Thank you.
Yep.
Um, how much property would you have to have before you'd have more than one brood in one in that you might see? And like how far would you have to go if you had a lot of acreage to see if there's multiple broods on your property?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So, I'd have to look at the exact home range size, but that doesn't mean that just because a turkey, a lot of it depends on the habitat requirements. Are they met on your property? And in some of these species, and we're going to talk about some of the mammals that have larger home ranges too, they may just be an occasional visitor on your property. So they may have a couple mile home range and your property is in their home range, but they're not spending all of their time only on your property. So in the case of turkeys and doing brood counts, um, you would be looking at, let's say you have 20 acres, you're probably only going to have a brood or two, depending on how and they're not necessarily, super territorial, but it's more if you have the habitat, the grasslands where they'll come and feed on invertebrates early as young, those would be the areas that you'd be looking to count them and keep track of them.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, so we're going to jump into a couple techniques for inventory and monitoring mammals on your property. Similar to birds, you can keep it simple and just keep a presence, absence, or an inventory of mammals that you have documented on your property. You're doing that year round. Again, you can keep locations noted on a property map. Um, and again, depending on what you find or discover, it might impact what you decide to do for management. And so you might be looking for tracks or scat, and we'll get into that here in a little bit. I will say in any of these techniques that we use, if you do come across a rather rare mammal, there is an opportunity for you to share those observations. So even, a badger is not a super common sighting. We have them in all of the counties, but they're still considered a rare mammal. And if you want, you can share those observations with the Department of Natural Resources. So if you do detect something that's unusual, you can certainly do that. So one technique you can use is a track station. These are my daughters a number of years ago, but we put in some track stations, and essentially you are rather than trying to trap or capture these medium to larger size mammals, you can lure them in with a scent and encourage them or entice them to leave their tracks in the sand and then determine their identity by reading those tracks. You can also pair a track station with a trail camera, which we'll talk about next, to kind of quiz yourself a little bit, or maybe you see some tracks in the sand and you're not sure what the animal is. Well, put a trail camera up on it and then help to determine that species. But you can also use it to validate your finding and test your ability to identify tracks. And so the idea with the track stations, then you start out by removing all the vegetation. So we take a shovel or a rake, depending on the type of habitat you're doing. This could just be raking the leaves here. And you would slide, get all of that vegetation off. And then what I recommend is using a fine masonry sand. So if you notice the picture of tracks here, this is all uniform, very small, particulate size sand. Using the dirt in the area or gravel, you're just not going to get a very clear track. So it makes sense to either buy play sand, children's play sand, or a masonry sand and bring it out. Then what I do is I take a 5-gallon bucket, fill it about half full, and then add a cup of mineral oil. So mineral oil doesn't have much of a scent to it, but what it does is it helps that sand maintain the moisture content and it leaves a better track. And so the best way to describe that is if you're walking along a beach and you walk in the sand, the dry sand, and you turn around, you just see a divot from your foot imprint. But if you walk in the wet sand where the wave action has come up along the beach, and you turn and look at your footprint, you'll see that the digits of your toes and so on. And so having that mineral oil mixed into the sand and then sifted, so using a screen or a homemade sifter, sift that sand down, then it provides a really nice tracking medium for those animals to leave those prints. And so then you see in the middle here, I just took a rock from the area and then used a lure. And so lure is different than using bait. And I would caution you on using bait because there are some species that we can't use bait for. So when it comes into like hunting for black bears and things like that, we can't use meat products in that case. So you want to be careful about leaving food. Same if you were going to sprinkle a can of corn, depending on the county that you're in. Corn, wildlife, or I'm sorry, wildlife feeding or baiting is illegal because of chronic wasting disease concerns in our white-tailed deer herd. So even without having to say those disclaimers, lure is a better option because food, like last night's Salisbury steak, spoils. It doesn't last very long. And you're playing off of that food reward. Instead, you want to use a lure, like a trapping lure. So going to a sporting goods store and looking for a trapping lure or ordering through a trapper's supply catalog and looking for things like bobcat urine or you can use shellfish paste, fox urine, different lures like that are very potent. And you can just take a stick then and take a little bit of that out of the jar and put it on that rock. That way the scent doesn't dissipate into the sand. I also will take that jar and dip some of the leaves or the needles from the trees in the area into that bottle and help to get that scent aloft. And that will carry much further than that Salisbury steak and it will stay fresh. And basically, then what you're playing on is these animals' territorial um, instincts. And so we're looking for things like bobcat and gray fox and red fox and fisher, mink, all sorts of things like that that will maybe utilize more than just your property, but they have larger home ranges and you're encouraging them as they come through and smell that to come over and take a peek. And so in this picture here, we have a coyote track coming from the top of the screen to the bottom. These bird tracks, you can see how nice of a bird track it is, and we can guess at the potential size of this bird, but really have no idea what species when it comes to, or at least I don't have any idea of what species when it comes to identifying the bird track. If we had a trail camera with it, we would know. And then this other track right here is a raccoon track.
Jamie, could you go over the mineral oil sand proportions
Yeah.
again?
So, my master's degree research was studying predators in grassland systems, and I would put in about 140 track stations a year to study the predator community around those pastures. And so I got really good at building track stations, but essentially, I would bring out about 5 gallons of sand and 1 cup of mineral oil. And in order to mix that in, I'd put half the sand in, half a cup of mineral oil, the rest of the sand, another half a cup of mineral oil. The other things to note, because these animals are generally more wary of human scent, I would definitely wear rubber gloves when you're mixing that sand and when you're sifting it. If you kneel on, either wear rubber boots or kneel on like a gardening mat, so that you're not putting your scent on the ground.
And where might someone get the lure that you talked about?
Yeah, so I mean, around here, going to a sporting goods store, they would have at least a basic selection of lures. So they're gonna be either urine based or glandular based. But the other thing you can do is just do a search for trapping supply catalogs, and they'll have lots of different lures in there as well.
Yeah, there's a question about whether you even need a lure if there's already animals passing
Yeah,
through there naturally.
yeah, that's a great question. And so that's what, do you see this little white, this was a piece of plaster. So the research project that I was doing, I could not entice the animal to come over and track. I needed it to be a passive sampling. I was looking at whether predators spent more time on wooded edges or non-wooded edges. And so I had a series of track stations on both of those edge types. And I couldn't have a lure where they just went down every track station. So I just used something novel, could be an aluminum can or a piece of flagging tape or something. I use this white plaster disc and I put it like right in the middle where that rock would be. And that way, if an animal was already close enough and in that habitat, but it saw that white disc, it was enough of a curiosity that it would come and take a look at it and leave its tracks. So the question in the chat, absolutely, you could build this track station right on an existing trail. You don't even need to build a track station. You can also do, you could just look in around streams and wet areas, or if you have lanes or trails on your property that have muddy areas, come and look at those after rain or while there's mud in there, and you'll get tracks there. And then one other thing too, if you want, keep in mind that you can make plaster casts of these tracks. So just by taking a plastic container and cutting the bottom out, so think about like a yogurt container, take the top off and then cut the bottom, so you just have the form on the edge or the edges of that form. Place it around the track and then get some plaster of Paris and water, mix it together so it's about the consistency of a milkshake, and then pour it in that track. Just leave it sit, come back 24 hours later, and you can pick that up and you'll have that track. And that's can be a fun thing to do with kids to collect animal tracks from your property. Okay, I'm gonna move on.
Yeah, there's a
Oh,
question about trail cameras, but I think, are you going to talk about trail cameras or?
yep,
Okay.
right after this. Um, let's see. So snow track surveys. So similar idea, except that you would wait until you get a fresh snowfall. So a day or two after a fresh snowfall, just going and walking around your property and finding sign again that these animals are leaving behind to determine what wildlife, what mammals are using your property. And so this one here is a raccoon track. You see the elongated heel pad, human-like hand, 5 fingers or 5 digits. This one here, to me, always looks like Morse code written in the snow, but this is otter. So they'll slide on their bellies and then hop a little bit and then slide. So really cool tracks, but they cover pretty large home ranges as well. And then just there's a lot of resources out there to help you distinguish different tracks from coyote to dog to gray fox. This is always a favorite one for me when you get a chance. When my daughters were little, we had them start following a mouse track in the snow, and this is how the track ended. So, asking them, what do you think happened? What is this? So, um, just enjoy your time outside and use keep them curious. All right. So, trail cameras are another option that you have for monitoring wildlife. Again, you don't have to live trap animals or get into any of that capture and monitoring. So it's just a great thing. Leave a trail camera out year round and see what wildlife you have coming through. This is my daughter. Her birthday's today, so she's 17 now, so it looks a little different than this. But we'd let the kids pick where they put the trail cameras. Where do you want to, look for sign and, where do you want to put those cameras? So, um, let's see here. And then as far as the trail cameras go, I'd be remiss not to mention Snapshot Wisconsin, which is a huge collaborative project between the DNR and the Division of Extension and others that is basically putting a statewide network of trail cameras on lands throughout the state in a grid system that will allow us and already is allowing us the data to be able to monitor wildlife by using the images that are captured. And so we've got enough data now that we're starting to be able to develop heat maps. So this is a percentage of cameras which detected a bobcat by county between 2018 and 2023. And so by having this grid of trail cameras in all these counties, we can now see what percent of counties have bobcat detected on their trail cameras. We're using this to inform elk management, white-tailed deer management, lots of different species. If you're interested in getting involved, you can apply to host a trail camera on your property. They'll actually provide you the training and the camera if they have a void or an opening in your area where they're looking to get a camera placed. And then you can also help by just classifying photos. There's lots of opportunities and really a wealth of information coming out of this project. And then I'll jump to that question in the chat, which was, how well does a trail camera work to get a picture of a screech owl leaving a nest box at night? Trail cameras are just like any other piece of electronic. You can spend $40 all the way to $500 or $600 for the cameras that they're using for the Snapshot Wisconsin project. The more you spend, the more quality in the pictures. Some of the trail cameras will record short video. I would, if you wanted to get a camera on a nest box, which Cornell Lab of Ornithology does. They have cameras on a number of different nest boxes. They do have some information on how to set up like live real-time camera video on a nest box. But if you were to set up a trail camera, I think you would capture that picture. I was looking through pictures from a trail camera near my home, and it picked up a screech owl. I'm sorry, a saw-whet owl that had landed in front of the camera, and a couple of images of it before it flew off again. So I think it certainly would. All right. And then another group of mammals, our only flying mammals, would be the bats that we have. And so we have about 8 species of bats. Roughly half of them migrate for the winter, and the other half will overwinter here. But come summer, we have the little brown bat and the big brown bat species, which will utilize a summer roost like a bat house, or they may roost in an attic or an outbuilding. And you can monitor their presence and absence if you would like to, and then also report that information. And so a couple of ways that you can report or that you can keep track is to monitor their occupancy. So is the bat house being used? And then also, can you count the individuals and their productivity? And so one of the ways that the DNR does this for larger colonies and bat roosts, but also individual bat houses, is in the evening in June to go out. Let's see, it would be, in June to go out at dusk and watch for bats emerging and count them as they emerge. And then to repeat that survey in July. And so what happens is bats have their young, called pups, in June, and they are able to fly then in July. So if you count twice, you'll get an estimate then of what the recruitment or what the reproduction look like for that particular colony. And I'll just leave, you can go to the Wisconsin Bat Monitoring Program. There's lots of opportunities to volunteer and to contribute to the work that they're doing through the use of acoustic surveys and roost surveys. And so, Bill, I wanted to just pause and ask you, I know we're going long here. Do you want to cut it off here, or do you want, I have some slides on herptiles yet. I'll leave it up to you.
Let's keep going.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to, I'll talk just real quickly about the deer harvest monitoring. So if deer are something you're interested in, I would hope that everybody is, because deer have a way of impacting the work that we do on our properties and our habitat management goals. No matter what we do, deer impact it one way or another with their population levels on our property. So one thing you can do is to keep track of that population. So if you do allow hunting or participate in hunting on your property, certainly keeping an annual harvest record over time, that can help give you an idea of whether your deer abundance is increasing, decreasing, or remaining stable. And it would involve, recording animals that are harvested, get an idea of their sex and age if you can. And then also, what's important is to note how many days did that person hunt and how many hours did they hunt, and then how many deer were seen, so that you can get an idea of what the effort was. So how many deer did they see per hours of hunting, and then what the success rate is, and compare that from year to year. All right, I'm going to jump ahead here to herptiles and just start the same way. You can just keep a general list of the turtles, snakes, lizards, frogs, toads, salamanders that you see on your property throughout the year. So presence or absence. And in some cases, remember with those frogs and the toad, we can hear them. And these are survey work that you're going to do from April to October. Again, you can also make notes on that property map on where you're having these sightings of these specific species. And then I mentioned this a little bit earlier, just a graphic here to explain, but with the frogs and toads, we have early calling frogs. And these are males that are advertising their presence to the females using their specific breeding call. Our early season breeders tend to lay their eggs in the temporary ponds. So it might be an old tire rut in a trail that we have, or a little vernal pool in the forest, because that water is warming up quicker. And also, it's always a great place because there's no fish, and so they don't have the predation by fish. But these early breeding frogs are the wood frog, peepers, northern leopard frogs. And late spring, we've got another collection of frogs that sing at that time, and including the American toad. And then we have our late summer breeders. And so I show this graph to explain that when we do our frog and toad surveys, it's really important that we sample at 3 different times. If we were to only do that survey in late spring and we did not detect wood frogs or spring peepers or green frogs, it may just be because of our timing. So it's important that when we look for frogs and toads that we do it, we had 3 sampling throughout the spring and summer. Just very quickly, there's a long-standing survey in the state called the Wisconsin Frog and Toad Survey. It's probably the longest citizen science survey that we have in the state. And essentially, it's doing these 3 different surveys, repeating the survey 3 times throughout the spring and summer. Tells you when what water temperatures you need to look for. And then you're essentially recording an abundance index. So when we go to the first location and we're listening for all of these frogs, which ones might we hear? Okay, let's say we hear a wood frog. Now we're giving that an abundance code. Okay, do we hear one individual wood frog, or are we hearing multiple calls of individuals, or we're hearing a full chorus? So based on our observation, we may give this a 1. We just hear 1 or 2 wood frogs. So this is a code of a 1. Next year, or maybe we even just the next pond that we go to on the property, maybe there's abundance of wood frogs, and we're giving that a code of a 3. So again, keeping this information over time, we can get a feel for what is going on with the frog and toad population on our property. I think I'm going to skip the pitfall just for the interest of time. But another thing you might consider to do for frogs, or for herptiles, specifically salamanders, snakes, and lizards, is to put out some cover boards. And cover boards are just simply a board. You do want it to be untreated, but they're just a hardwood board. I would say minimum of 2 by 4 feet, but you can go bigger than that, about a 1/4 inch thick. And basically, the more weathered, the better. And you're laying this on top of existing vegetation. So whether that is in a grassy area adjacent to woods that get some sunlight, that might be a really good place for snakes, or under a closed canopy in a more moist soil that would be attractive to salamanders. And essentially, you're leaving these boards to weather. It takes time for these small animals to find them, but eventually they provide some habitat and cover for these wildlife, and can be places where you go and lift those up and look for their presence in the area. Also, not a bad idea to GPS these locations, and then you can actually add their location to your map and just in general be able to find them when you want to come back to them. So visiting them a couple of times through the spring and summer, even after rain is a good time for the salamanders, and just see what species you might detect by putting these cover boards out there. All right, just a couple slides here to wrap up, but just in terms of monitoring wildlife, just keep in mind that regularly monitoring the wildlife allows you to really understand your property and its potential to provide homes for wildlife. And you're going to also start to kind of put together what habitats are favorable for which species and what management efforts you can do to increase their abundance or just even to encourage their presence to begin with. And don't lose track of it being a really fun way to engage kids, connecting them with nature. Have them come and check the nest boxes with you, flip over those cover boards, all of those different things. And of course, it should be fun. This shouldn't feel like a chore or something you have to do. Take as much or as little of this content as you'd like to apply and to really engage in your property. And then lastly, for those of you that might be interested in really diving into some of these citizen science opportunities to report your observations, this website right here will take you to the page that you see. And if you click on Get Involved, there's a link to get involved through some of the DNR programs, and then a separate link to get involved or to look for a citizen based monitoring program in your county. And I'll just show you the front page of those. So this is what the DNR one will take you to. You see the Bumblebee Brigade, Snapshot Wisconsin. There's a volunteer carnivore tracking program. And then through the database where you can look for programs in your area, you can actually search it by county. I just did a quick search for Columbia County, and these are all of the different monitoring programs that you could get involved with if you want. There's one on kestrel boxes, lake monitoring, prairie enthusiasts, butterfly association, lots of different opportunities.
Along those lines, the Christmas bird count,
Yes.
how do folks get connected to that?
Yeah, so best thing to do would be to go to the Christmas, just go ahead and do an internet search for the Christmas bird count. You'll get to their national website, and then they'll have a link to how to find a survey in your area. And usually that will get you to somebody so a lot of those surveys are already occupied or there's a volunteer coordinating them, but they should be able to get you to a coordinator's name where you can then contact them and see if you can participate alongside. And then I'll just put a plug in here, a shameless plug for a private landowner program that I help to coordinate. It's called the Wisconsin Coverts Project. And it's a 3-day program for landowners that are interested in managing for wildlife. And it's intensive. We have lots of forest and wildlife biologists that come in and provide presentations. And we also do a number of field trips. One of those field trips is about 3 hours of inventory and monitoring wildlife. So I'll go out ahead of time and set up some of these stations, trail cameras, track stations, songbird point counts, some surveys for herptiles. And then we'll go out there together and take a look at what we find and again, explore more firsthand in the person what that entails. If you're interested in applying, applications are due June 15th. If you just do a search for the Wisconsin Coverts Project, you'll get to the website, lots of additional information from there. All right, and I'll leave it at that. I do apologize for going long. I did not think I would talk that much, but obviously too many examples for each of these. So
Now, it's great stuff. I appreciate your time, Jamie. We'll wrap it up here. I'll send Jamie's connection information in the email that I send out with the recording, and along with the link to the publication she has showing in the last slide here. So thanks a lot, Jamie, and we'll see everybody on Thursday to talk about improving your trails for wildlife. Thanks, everyone.